On a spring morning in 1968, deep inside the Soviet Union, two men climbed into a small military jet for what should have been a routine training flight. One of them was the most famous human being on Earth. His name was Yuri Gagarin. 7 years earlier, he had done something no one had ever done before. He left the planet, circled it in space, and came back alive. For millions of people in the Soviet Union and far beyond, Gagarin was not just a pilot. He was proof that a human being could break the limits of the sky. And yet, on that ordinary day in March, his aircraft plunged into the ground at high speed, killing him instantly. What exactly happened in those final minutes has never been fully agreed on, and the way the Soviet authorities handled his death created one of the strangest and darkest mysteries of the space age. To understand why Gagarin's last flight is so unsettling, you have to remember what he meant to his country and to the world. In April 1961, when his spacecraft completed one orbit of the Earth, the Cold War was at its most intense. The United States and the Soviet Union were racing to prove who had the better technology, the stronger system, the brighter future. When Gagarin returned from space smiling, the Soviet leadership turned him into a legend almost overnight. His face appeared on posters, stamps, and statues. Children learned his name in school as if he were a mythical hero from an old story. Even in the West, where newspapers worried about Soviet power, people were fascinated by him. He seemed modest, friendly, and strangely human for someone who had just traveled through the void. But glory came with a price. The Soviet state treated Gagarin less as a person and more as a symbol that had to be protected. After his historic flight, he was allowed to fly in space only once more, as a backup on a later mission, and even that plan was carefully controlled. Officials feared that if anything happened to him in another mission, it would be a catastrophic blow to national pride. There were rumors that he wanted to return to active cosmonaut duty, that he missed the danger and the feeling of pushing the limits. Instead, he was sent on tours, speeches, and official ceremonies, shaking hands with foreign leaders and smiling for endless photographs. On the outside, he was the perfect hero. On the inside, he was still a test pilot who loved flying fast machines. By the late 1960s, Gagarin had finally been allowed to refresh his skills as a jet pilot. On March 27, 1968, he and an instructor named Vladimir Seryogin took off in a MiG-15 UTI, a two-seat training jet, from an airfield not far from Moscow. The mission profile was simple. A short flight to practice basic maneuvers and instrument navigation. They were not supposed to perform anything risky or experimental. Radio contact was normal at first. Then, suddenly, nothing. When ground control failed to reach the jet, search teams were sent out. What they found was horrifying. Wreckage scattered across a forested area, the fuselage torn apart, the cockpit crushed. Both men were dead. The official investigation that followed was massive, involving high-ranking officers, engineers, and cosmonauts. Yet the conclusion that eventually reached the public was strangely vague. The report said the crash was likely caused by a sudden maneuver to avoid an unexpected obstacle in the air, possibly a weather balloon or another aircraft, which forced the jet into a dangerous attitude from which it could not recover in time. There was talk of bad weather, of outdated instruments, of possible turbulence. But many details were classified. Ordinary people were given a simple message. The nation's greatest hero had died in a tragic accident, and that was all they needed to know. This lack of clarity opened the door to countless theories. Some suggested that Gagarin or his instructor had made a basic mistake under pressure, misreading their instruments and sending the jet into a deadly dive. Others argued that the aircraft itself might have been faulty, suffering from mechanical problems that someone tried to hide. A more dramatic theory claimed that another jet, flying too close and too fast in restricted airspace, had disturbed the air around Gagarin's plane, creating turbulence that flipped it into a spin. Without enough altitude to recover, the MiG slammed into the ground before the pilots could eject. There were even darker speculations. Because Gagarin was not just a pilot but a powerful symbol, some people quietly wondered whether his death had been truly accidental. Stories spread that he had angered someone in the leadership, or that his popularity made him dangerous in an era when public adoration was supposed to belong only to the party and its current rulers. In this version of events, the crash was not a simple mishap, but the clean, deniable end of a man who had outlived his role. There is no solid evidence to support this claim, but the secrecy of the Soviet system made it impossible to fully dismiss. Decades later, additional information slowly began to appear. Former cosmonauts and officials offered their own recollections. One well-known account suggested that a supersonic jet had been flying nearby in violation of safety rules. As it passed, its shockwave might have hit Gagarin's slower training plane, forcing it into a spiral. According to this explanation, the truth was embarrassing but not sinister. Human negligence and poor coordination, not conspiracy. Still, key documents remained hidden or heavily edited, and the full data from the flight recorders was never freely available for independent study. Each new partial revelation only raised new questions. The way the Soviet government handled Gagarin's memory after his death added another layer to the unease. He was buried with immense honor inside the walls of the Kremlin. Streets, towns, and schools across the country were named after him. Monuments rose in his image, nose turned toward the sky. Official speeches spoke of his courage, his loyalty, his smile. But they almost never spoke in detail about the final flight, the investigation, or the lessons learned. The myth of the perfect hero was preserved, while the messy, uncomfortable reality of his fate stayed in the shadows. For many people outside the Soviet Union, especially in the United States and Europe, Gagarin's story has always contained this strange contrast. On one hand, he is the face on the magazine covers, the man who looked out of a tiny window at the blue curve of the earth and supposedly said it was beautiful. On the other hand, he is the victim of an opaque system that controlled every piece of information about his life and death. The same state that lifted him up as proof of its greatness also refused to fully explain how it let him die in a training flight that should have been safe. Today, when we look back at the early space race, it is easy to be blinded by the romance of rockets and the excitement of firsts. But behind every achievement was a network of secrecy, pressure, and fear. Pilots and cosmonauts pushed their bodies and machines to the limit, often without knowing the full risks they faced. Engineers struggled to meet impossible deadlines set more by politics than by safety. Mistakes were buried. Failures were whispered about behind closed doors. Publicly, everything remained heroic. Privately, the cost in human lives was staggering. Yuri Gagarin stands at the center of this paradox. He was unquestionably brave. He risked his life for a mission whose dangers were barely understood at the time. He inspired not only his own country but the whole planet. Yet the way his story ended reminds us that even the brightest heroes are not safe inside systems that value their symbolic power more than their human fragility. His last flight was officially just an accident. But the silence, the missing pages, and the conflicting testimonies make it feel like something more than that, a crack in the shining surface of the Soviet dream, through which we can glimpse the chaos underneath. When you see his smiling face on old posters or stamps, you are looking at a carefully chosen image, repeated until it became almost sacred. The real man behind that image loved speed, risk, and the open sky. He lived long enough to see himself turned into a living monument and then died in a field far from the cameras, his cockpit torn apart, his final words lost in static. The truth about exactly what happened in those last minutes may never be known with certainty. What remains is a haunting question. If this is how the most treasured hero of the space age was protected, what chance did anyone else have? In the end, Yuri Gagarin's story is both inspiring and chilling. It shows what a single human being can achieve when courage, skill, and opportunity collide. But it also shows how, in a system built on secrecy and control, even the greatest of heroes can become a fragile piece on a much larger board, celebrated when useful, and then quietly removed when tragedy strikes. His first flight took him beyond the Earth. His last flight brought him down into a mystery that still casts a long shadow over the history of the Soviet Union and over the way we remember the true cost of the race for the stars.